Welcome back, The Enigma of the Ebony Clock. Chapter 1. Snow fell thickly over Geneva on that January evening in 1962, transforming the quays along the lake into silent white corridors. The city, usually alive with a discreet hum of precision industry, seemed to hold its breath beneath the blanket of flakes. At the Gare Cornavin, the Paris Express disgorged its passengers into the chill, and among them stepped a small, dapper man whose overcoat bore the faintest dusting of snow on the astrakhan collar. Hercule Poirot carried himself with the careful dignity of one who refused to let the weather disorder either his appearance or his thoughts. A black Citroën idled at the curb, its driver holding a small card, M.H. Poirot. The journey through the old town was brief. The car turned onto the Quai des Bergues and stopped before a handsome 18th century building whose upper floors glowed softly behind tall windows. Here, in the Atelier Duval, the International Horological Exhibition had drawn a select company of watchmakers, collectors, and industrialists for a private viewing. The snow ensured few would leave before morning. Inside, the air carried the faint metallic scent of oil, polished brass, and aged wood. Glass cases lined the walls, each containing treasures, enameled pocket watches from the 18th century, marine chronometers of gleaming precision, carriage clocks under crystal domes. At the far end, beneath a velvet drape, stood the centerpiece, the Ebony Clock. Crafted in 1789 by Abraham Louis Breguet for an émigré nobleman, its black lacquer case was inlaid with mother-of-pearl constellations. The mechanism, visible through a glazed panel, moved with hypnotic regularity. Its reputation for accuracy was legendary. Etienne Duval awaited in the private atelier beyond the exhibition hall. The master clockmaker, tall and stooped at 65, had white hair still thick and hands that trembled only slightly as he greeted his guest. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, voice low, "thank you for coming so promptly. I fear the matter is grave." Poirot inclined his head. "When a man of your reputation sends an urgent summons, one does not delay. You spoke in your telegram of threats." Duval nodded. "Anonymous notes, warnings. And tonight I intend to make an announcement that will provoke strong feelings." He gestured toward the exhibition rooms. "Come, meet them first." The hall had filled with the invited company. Duval introduced each with measured courtesy. Madame Claire Vallière, Duval's niece by marriage, stood near a display of repeating watches. 38, elegant in black velvet, she managed the atelier's commercial affairs with quiet efficiency. Her smile was polished, but her left hand remained tucked into the folds of her skirt, a small, habitual gesture. Monsieur Lucien Morel from La Chaux-de-Fonds was 50, sharp-featured, impeccably tailored. A rival whose firm had lost a significant contract to Duval years earlier, he carried himself with the tension of old grievance. The scent of Turkish tobacco clung faintly to his cuff. Herr Dr. Karl Reinhardt, broad-shouldered and outwardly jovial, represented a Schaffhausen concern eager to license new mechanisms for larger production. His eyes moved often to the draped Ebony Clock, assessing rather than admiring. Mademoiselle Sophie Laurent, 29, had come from Paris to assist with restorations. Her fingers bore traces of bluing solution. Her manner was guarded, though her work on Duval's pieces had earned quiet praise. Some whispered she was more than protégée. Monsieur Philippe Garnier, 55, ruddy, and English-accented despite Swiss nationality, was a collector whose acquisition sometimes bordered on the aggressive. A gold hunter watch in his waistcoat pocket chimed the quarters with irritating punctuality. Jacques Benoit, 24, Duval's apprentice, worked quietly at a bench near the back. Intense and gifted, he had lately spent long nights on private projects Duval had not inspected. Poirot moved among them, observing. He noted the way Madame Vallières avoided meeting Morel's gaze, the slight clench of Morel's jaw when Duval's name was spoken, Reinhardt's too hearty laugh, the quick glance Sophie Laurent cast toward the atelier door, Garnier's habit of fingering his watch chain, Benoit's careful avoidance of eye contact. The snow continued to fall outside. Someone remarked that the mountain passes might close by dawn. The city felt sealed, intimate, dangerous in its isolation. Duval raised his hands for attention. The soft ticking from dozens of mechanisms filled the brief silence. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "tonight we honor the past and look to the future. Tomorrow I shall submit to the Patent Office my new constant force escapement, a mechanism of revolutionary design. It is complete. It is mine alone, and it will redefine precision in fine watchmaking." A murmur spread through the room. Madame Vallières' smile stiffened. Morel's hand paused on his cuff. Reinhardt's expression remained genial, but his eyes narrowed. Sophie Laurent drew a slow breath. Garnier gave a small, surprised whistle. Benoit looked up sharply from his bench. Poirot watched every face. The lights flickered once, twice, then held steady. Outside, the wind rose against the windows. Inside, the clocks continued their measured march toward midnight. Poirot smoothed his moustaches with a small, deliberate gesture. The game, he reflected, had begun. Chapter 2. The clock struck 11 in a soft, overlapping chorus that seemed, for a moment, to fill every corner of the Atelier Duval. Then silence returned, broken only by the low murmur of conversation and the occasional chime of a quarter hour. Etienne Duval had withdrawn to his private atelier shortly after the announcement, leaving the guests to circulate among the displays. The snow outside had thickened into a steady fall. The tall windows were now opaque white curtains, reflecting the warm glow of the chandeliers. No one spoke of leaving. The mountain roads would be impassable until the ploughs came at dawn, if they came at all. Hercule Poirot stood near the ebony clock, hands clasped behind his back, studying the slow sweep of its pendulum. He noted the faint irregularity in its beat, nothing alarming, merely the tiny eccentricity that distinguishes a living mechanism from a machine. Around him, the company drifted in small groups. Madame Vallières spoke quietly with Mademoiselle Laurent near a case of enamelled verge watches. Monsieur Morel stood alone by the door to the atelier, arms folded, staring at the floor. Dr. Reinhardt circulated with forced bonhomie, offering small compliments on the collection. Garnier consulted his hunter watch every few minutes, as though impatient for the evening to end. Young Benoit remained at his bench, polishing a balance wheel with meticulous care. At 11:23, the door to the private atelier opened. Duval appeared, face pale but composed. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, raising his voice just enough to command attention, "if you would join me, I wish to demonstrate the prototype before we adjourn." The group moved toward the atelier in a loose procession. Poirot followed last, eyes scanning every face. The private atelier was long and narrow, lit by two green-shaded lamps. A large workbench occupied the center, covered with tools, loops, and a single small clock movement clamped in a vise. Beside it stood a brass and ebony model no larger than a pocket watch, the constant force escapement, its components gleaming under the light. Duval lifted the prototype with reverent fingers. "This," he said, "is the future, a remontoire d'égalité that delivers perfectly uniform impulse regardless of mainspring tension. Tomorrow it goes to the patent office. Tonight I show it to those who understand its worth." He wound the tiny mainspring with a delicate key. The balance began to oscillate. A soft, even tick filled the room. Cleaner, more precise than any mechanism Poirot had ever heard. For several seconds the company watched in silence. Then Duval reached for a small glass dome that covered a second, identical prototype. As his hand passed over the first model, he paused, frowned, and drew a sharp breath. "Strange," he murmured. "The balance is sluggish." He bent closer. At that instant a faint hiss sounded, sharp, almost inaudible. A thin vapor rose from the base of the prototype, colorless, odorless. Duval straightened abruptly, hand flying to his throat. His eyes widened. He staggered back one step, two, then collapsed across the workbench, knocking tools to the floor. The prototype fell with him, shattering against the tiles. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos. Madame Vallière cried out. Reinhardt rushed forward, knelt, felt for a pulse. "He is not breathing!" Morel pushed past Garnier to the door and flung it open, shouting for the night porter. Sophie Laurent stood frozen, hands pressed to her mouth. Benoit dropped to his knees beside his master, face ashen. Poirot was already moving. He stepped carefully around the fallen body, avoiding the scattered fragments of the prototype. He bent over Duval without touching him. The clockmaker's face was flushed an unnatural crimson. His lips were blue. His eyes stared upward, pupils fixed. "Poison," Poirot said quietly. "Almost certainly a gas, fast-acting. Cyanide, perhaps, or something similar." He straightened and looked around the room. "Everyone will please remain exactly where they are. No one touches anything." The night porter arrived, breathless, then recoiled at the sight. "Fetch the police," Poirot instructed, "and close the outer doors. No one leaves this building." The porter nodded and hurried away. Reinhardt rose slowly. "Monsieur Poirot, you are certain?" "I am certain he is dead," Poirot replied. "The rest we shall discover." He turned his attention to the shattered prototype. A small glass vial lay broken among the pieces. From its neck trailed a thin tube that had been concealed beneath the base plate. The tube was now empty, but the faint, acrid scent of bitter almonds lingered in the air. "Constructed with great care," Poirot murmured. "A timed release, perhaps triggered by the winding key or by the heat of a hand. Ingenious and deadly." Madame Vallière had begun to tremble. Who could have done this? Etienne was... He was loved by everyone here. "Not everyone, madame," Poirot said gently. He looked at the faces around him. Shock, fear, guilt, calculation, each expression distinct, each telling. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. The snow fell harder. Inside, the clocks continued their measured counting, indifferent to the life that had just ended. Poirot smoothed his moustaches. "The little grey cells," he said to himself. "They are awake, and they have much work to do." The police would come. Questions would be asked. Alibis would be offered. Lies would be told. But first, the scene must be preserved. Poirot turned to the company. "We will wait here, all of us, until the authorities arrive. No one will leave this room, and no one will touch the body or the mechanism." He paused, letting the words settle. "Someone among you," he said softly, "has already begun to calculate how best to explain their movements during the last 10 minutes. A ripple of unease passed through the group. Poirot smiled faintly. "Bon, let us begin." Chapter 3. The police arrived shortly before midnight, stamping snow from their boots in the vestibule below. 2 uniformed officers were followed by a plainclothes inspector, Inspector Marc Fournier, a lean, grey-haired man of about 50, whose face carried the weary patience of one who had seen too many sudden deaths in elegant surroundings. He recognized Poirot at once. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, offering a brief handshake, "I did not expect to find you here. This changes matters." Nothing changes, mon ami, Poirot replied mildly. A death has occurred. The facts remain the same. Fournier glanced around the atelier. Duval's body still lay where it had fallen, though a sheet had been drawn over it at Poirot's insistence. The shattered prototype lay in fragments on the tiles. The broken glass vial and its attached tube had been left untouched. Gas, you think? Fournier asked. Almost certainly. The symptoms, crimson flush, blue lips, fixed pupils, are consistent with hydrocyanic acid, swift, silent, and mercifully quick. Fournier nodded to one of his men who began photographing the scene with careful flashes. We will remove the body shortly. In the meantime, no one leaves. Statements will be taken from everyone. Poirot inclined his head. A wise precaution, and now, if you will permit, I should like to ask a few questions while events are fresh. Fournier hesitated only a moment. He had worked with Poirot before. He knew the value of the little Belgian's methods. Very well, but I shall remain present. The company had been herded into the main exhibition hall, where the ticking of the clock seemed louder in the strained silence. They sat on the few chairs or stood in uneasy clusters. Poirot moved among them like a small, precise metronome. He began with Madame Vallière. She sat nearest the door, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Madame, Poirot said gently, you were standing close to Mademoiselle Laurent when Monsieur Duval called us into the atelier. Did you notice anything unusual before he collapsed? Claire Vallière shook her head. Nothing. He seemed perfectly well when he spoke to us. A little pale, perhaps, but he had been working late. I thought only that he was tired. You are his niece by marriage? Widow of his late partner, yes. Etienne and I were close in recent years. Business partners, of course? Of course, Poirot murmured. And the prototype, he showed it to you earlier this evening? No, he was secretive about the final adjustments. He said only that it was finished and would secure the future of the atelier. Poirot nodded and moved on. Monsieur Morel stood apart, arms folded, staring at the floor. Monsieur Morel, Poirot began, you were near the door when the body fell. You opened it to call for help, a natural impulse, yet you did not approach the body yourself. Morel's jaw tightened. I'm not a doctor. I saw he was beyond help. Very sensible. You have known Monsieur Duval many years. Long enough to know his work and his arrogance. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Arrogance? He announced his new escapement tonight as though no one else had ever dreamed of such a thing. My own firm has been experimenting with constant force mechanisms for 3 years. He knew that. Yet you came to the exhibition. I came to see what he had produced, and to ensure my own patents were not infringed upon. Poirot smiled faintly. A prudent man. Next he approached Dr. Reinhardt, who had recovered his composure, and now stood with hands in pockets watching the police. Herr Doctor, Poirot said, you were closest to Duval when he fell. You checked for a pulse. Reinhardt nodded. Habit? I trained as a physician before I entered industry. You found none? None. He was gone in seconds. You seemed unsurprised by the announcement of the new escapement. Reinhardt gave a short laugh. Surprised? No. We had heard rumors. My company has been negotiating with Duval for months to license any new developments. Tonight's display was theatrical, but not unexpected. And if the patent is now delayed or contested? Reinhardt's expression remained genial. Business continues, Monsieur Poirot. One adapts. Poirot turned to Mademoiselle Sophie Laurent. She stood near the workbench, where she had been assisting earlier, fingers still faintly stained with bluing. Mademoiselle, you have worked closely with Monsieur Duval. Did he ever speak of threats? Anonymous notes, perhaps? Sophie's eyes flicked toward the covered body, then away. He mentioned receiving letters. He dismissed them as jealousy from competitors. He said he had dealt with worse. You were in the atelier earlier this evening, adjusting a display piece? Yes. A verge watch needed cleaning. I finished just before the demonstration. Poirot nodded. And the prototype? You had not seen it before tonight? No. Etienne kept it locked in his private safe until this evening. Merci. Philippe Garnier was next, still consulting his hunter watch as though it might tell him when this unpleasantness would end. Monsieur Garnier, you collect fine timepieces. You must have coveted the Ebony Clock. Garnier gave a hearty chuckle that did not reach his eyes. Coveted? Of course. But Duval would never sell, said it was the soul of the atelier. And the new escapement, would it have interested you as a collector? Enormously. A revolutionary mechanism in a private collection? Priceless? Yet you seemed startled by the announcement. Startled, perhaps? One doesn't expect a man to unveil his masterpiece and then drop dead 5 minutes later. Finally, young Jacques Benoit. He sat on a stool near the back, face pale, hands clasped between his knees. Jacques, Poirot said quietly, you were Duval's apprentice. You worked late many nights. On what? Benoit swallowed. Personal projects, improvements to existing movements, nothing important. You did not work on the constant force escapement? No, Monsieur Duval kept that to himself. He said it was too delicate for anyone else. Poirot studied the boy's face. You looked up sharply when he made the announcement, as though you had not expected it. Benoit hesitated. I knew it was close to completion, but I did not know he would show it tonight. Poirot stepped back and addressed the room. Mesdames et messieurs, one small detail troubles me. When Monsieur Duval bent over the prototype and remarked that the balance was sluggish, he paused. He drew a breath. And then the gas was released. He turned to Fournier. Inspector, have you examined the mechanism? Fournier nodded. A small vial of hydrocyanic acid, concealed beneath the base plate. A thin tube led to a tiny bellows arrangement. When pressure was applied to a hidden switch, perhaps by the heat of a hand or the winding key, the bellows compressed, forcing the gas upward through perforations in the movement plate. Poirot nodded. Precise, professional, the work of someone familiar with horology. He paused, letting the implications settle. And now another small matter. When the prototype fell, it shattered, yet one piece, a small brass gear, was not among the fragments on the floor. I have looked. It is missing. A murmur ran through the group. Poirot smiled faintly. It will, of course, be found. The little grey cells do not forget. He turned to Fournier. Inspector, I suggest the building be searched, discreetly, and that no one leaves until morning. Fournier gave a curt nod. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing Geneva in white silence. Inside, the clocks ticked on, counting the seconds toward revelation. Chapter 4. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the police had completed their initial examination of the atelier. Duval's body had been removed to the mortuary under heavy snow cover. The shattered prototype remained on the floor, cordoned with thin tape. Inspector Fournier had taken formal statements from everyone, but the atmosphere in the exhibition hall had grown heavier, as though the ticking clocks themselves were growing impatient. The company had been permitted to retire to the small upstairs apartments that Duval kept for visiting guests and staff. 3 modest bedrooms and a sitting room with a low fire. No one slept. Doors remained ajar, footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs, low voices carried in the stillness. Poirot had claimed the smallest room, but did not undress. Instead, he sat in an armchair by the window, watching the snow swirl past the glass, turning over the facts in his mind with the slow deliberation of a man polishing a lens. At 3:30, he rose and moved quietly downstairs. The exhibition hall was empty, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lamps. The clocks ticked on, each in its own rhythm. Poirot approached the workbench where the prototype had lain. He knelt, careful not to disturb the tape, and examined the fragments once more. The missing brass gear troubled him. Small, barely the size of a fingernail, yet its absence was deliberate. Someone had taken it, perhaps as a trophy, perhaps to conceal evidence of tampering, or perhaps, he reflected, to plant it elsewhere. He straightened and moved toward the back of the hall, where Jacques Benoit's workbench stood. The apprentice's tools were neatly arrayed: loops, screwdrivers, oilers, a small brass tray of spare parts. Poirot lifted the tray slightly. Beneath it lay a folded scrap of paper. He opened it with tweezers. A single line in neat script: "Midnight, the Ebony Clock, bring the drawings." No signature. The paper was ordinary, but the ink had a faint bluish sheen, similar to the bluing solution Mademoiselle Laurent used on her restorations. Poirot replaced the note exactly as he had found it, and continued his quiet circuit. In the sitting room, a low conversation was in progress. Madame Vallières and Mademoiselle Laurent sat near the fire, speaking in hushed tones. Poirot paused in the doorway, unobserved. "He never mentioned the final adjustments to me," Sophie was saying. "Not once. I thought we were closer than that." Claire's voice was gentle but firm. "Etienne trusted few people with his secrets, Sophie. You know how he was, obsessed with perfection. He would have shown you eventually." "Eventually?" Sophie repeated bitterly. "After the patent was filed, after someone else had no chance to claim it." Claire looked up sharply. "You think someone stole it?" "I think someone feared losing everything, the atelier, the reputation, the future." Poirot withdrew silently and climbed the stairs again. In the corridor, he met Philippe Garnier emerging from his room, dressing gown tied loosely, hunter watch still in hand. "Monsieur Poirot," Garnier said, startled, "you're up late." "Sleep is for those without puzzles to solve," Poirot replied. "And you, monsieur, also sleepless?" Garnier gave a rueful smile. "Hard to rest when a man dies 3 meters from where you're standing, and harder still, knowing the police will soon be asking about motives." "You have one." "Only the usual collector's greed. I wanted the Ebony Clock. I offered a ridiculous sum last year. Duval laughed in my face. Said it was not for sale at any price." "And the new escapement?" Garnier shrugged. "A collector dreams of owning the prototype of a revolution, but murder? No, I buy, I do not kill." Poirot studied him. "Yet you were startled tonight more than the others." "Was I? Perhaps I simply dislike surprises." They parted, Garnier returning to his room, Poirot continuing to the head of the stairs. At 4 o'clock, Dr. Reinhardt appeared in the sitting room, fully dressed, carrying a small attaché case. He poured coffee from a thermos and sat alone, staring into the flames. Poirot descended and joined him without invitation. "Herr Doctor, you do not sleep?" Reinhardt looked up. "I prefer to think when the world is quiet. And you?" "I think best when others sleep." A silence fell between them. "You knew of the anonymous notes," Poirot said at length. Reinhardt nodded. "Etienne confided in me last month. He suspected industrial espionage, someone attempting to copy the design before patent. He asked if my company had heard rumors. And had you?" "None, but I offered to increase security here during the exhibition. He declined, said he trusted his own people." Trust, Poirot murmured, is a fragile mechanism. Reinhardt gave a short laugh. Indeed, and now the patent will be delayed. The atelier may pass to Madame Vallière or to the courts. Either way, my company loses months, perhaps years. Unless someone contests the patent posthumously, Poirot suggested. Reinhardt's eyes narrowed. You think someone has evidence that the design was not entirely Duval's? It is a possibility. One must consider all angles. Reinhardt set down his coffee. If you are suggesting I or my firm arranged this, you are mistaken. We wanted the license, not a scandal. Poirot inclined his head. Yet scandals can be useful sometimes. They weaken competitors. Reinhardt smiled thinly. You are a dangerous man, Monsieur Poirot. At that moment, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Lucien Morel appeared, coat over his arm, face drawn. I cannot stay here, he announced to the room. I must return to my hotel. The police can question me there. Poirot rose. Monsieur Morel, the snow has not stopped. The streets are impassable. Morel glared. Then I will walk. I will not remain under suspicion in this mausoleum. Inspector Fournier appeared from the vestibule below. No one leaves until daylight, monsieur. My orders. Morel's shoulders sagged. He turned and climbed the stairs again. Poirot watched him go, then returned to his room. Dawn was still hours away, but already the first pale light filtered through the snow-laden windows. The clocks struck 5 in their staggered chorus. Poirot sat at the small desk and drew a sheet of paper toward him. He began to write, in his neat, precise hand, suspects and motives, Madame Vallière, inheritance/control of atelier, Monsieur Morel, professional jealousy / possible prior claim, Dr. Reinhardt, corporate advantage / delay of pardon, Mademoiselle Laurent, betrayal / possible shared credit denied, monsieur, Garnier, collector's obsession, J. Benoit, apprentices, secret projects / hidden ambition, and beneath, clue, missing gear, clue, note under tray, bluing ink, clue, Morel's sudden desire to leave. He underlined the last line twice. Then, very softly, he murmured, Ah, the little grey cells, they begin to turn. Outside, the snow fell on, relentless, burying Geneva deeper in silence. Chapter 5. Dawn crept in grey and reluctant, the snow still falling though more lightly now, as though the storm had spent its worst fury during the night. By 6 o'clock the lights in the Atelier Duval burned steadily again, and the company reassembled in the exhibition hall under Inspector Fournier's watchful eye. Coffee had been brought from a nearby café that had somehow opened despite the drifts. It stood untouched on a side table. No one had slept more than an hour or two. Faces were drawn, eyes shadowed. The ticking of the clock seemed louder, more accusatory. Poirot entered last, immaculate as ever, moustaches waxed to perfection. He carried a small notebook in which he had jotted observations during the small hours. Fournier cleared his throat. The passes are still blocked, but the main roads into the city are being cleared. By midday, we should be able to move the body and bring in a full forensic team. Until then, no one leaves the building. A murmur of protest rose, quickly stifled. Madame Vallière spoke first, voice tight. This is intolerable. We are prisoners. You are witnesses, Fournier corrected. And one of you is almost certainly a murderer. Silence fell, broken only by the soft chime of Philippe Garnier's hunter watch marking the quarter hour. Poirot stepped forward. Inspector, if I may suggest, we should search the premises more thoroughly, now that daylight permits. The missing gear may yet be found. Fournier nodded. I agree. 2 of my men will conduct the search. Everyone will remain here. The policeman moved off, one to the private atelier. the other upstairs to the apartments. The company waited in uneasy quiet. 10 minutes later, one of the officers returned, face grim. In his gloved hand, he held a small brass gear, identical in size and tooth pattern to the one missing from the shattered prototype. "Where?" Fournier demanded. "Under the floorboard in Monsieur Morel's room. Loose board near the window. It had been pried up recently." All eyes turned to Lucien Morel. The watchmaker from La Chaux-de-Fonds rose slowly, face pale. "This is absurd. I have never seen that gear before." "Yet it was in your room," Fournier said. "Planted," Morel snapped. "Someone wishes to divert suspicion from themselves." Poirot regarded him calmly. "You wished to leave last night, monsieur? You were most insistent." "I felt unwell. The atmosphere here." Morel gestured around the hall. "It oppresses." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. Fournier motioned to his man. "Monsieur Morel, you will come with me downstairs for further questioning." Morel stiffened. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," Fournier said, "but you will remain in custody until we can verify your movements." As Morel was led away, the remaining suspects exchanged glances, relief mingled with fresh wariness. Poirot moved to the window and looked out. The street below was still buried, but a plough could be heard in the distance, scraping metal against stone. He turned back to the room. A false lead, perhaps, or the first crack in the mechanism. Sophie Laurent spoke suddenly, voice low. "There is something else you should know." All attention shifted to her. "Last night, before the demonstration, I saw Jacques in the atelier. He was alone with the prototype. He left hurriedly when he heard footsteps." Jacques Benoit flushed crimson. "I was checking the oil on the balance staff. Monsieur Duval asked me to do so earlier." "Did he?" Poirot asked gently. "Yes, I swear it. But you did not mention this when questioned." I was afraid it would look suspicious." "It does look suspicious, young man," Garnier said bluntly. Sophie continued. "And there is more. Etienne had begun to doubt Jacques' loyalty. He told me the boy had been asking too many questions about the constant force design, questions that went beyond an apprentice's curiosity." Jacques looked stricken. "That is not true. I only wanted to learn." Poirot studied the apprentice's face. "Fear, yes, but also something fiercer, ambition perhaps." Or guilt. Before he could speak again, a sharp crack sounded from the vestibule below. The front door had been forced open against the snow. Cold air rushed in. A new figure appeared at the top of the stairs, a tall woman in a fur-collared coat, face half hidden by a scarf. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm. "Claire?" she called. Madame Vallière stood. "Marie, what are you doing here?" The newcomer, Marie Duval, Etienne's estranged younger sister, descended the last steps. "I received a letter from Etienne 2 days ago. He said if anything happened to him, I was to bring this to the police." She opened the portfolio and withdrew a thin sheaf of papers. "These are copies of his working drawings for the escapement," she said, "and a note saying he feared sabotage. He wrote that if the patent were contested after his death, these would prove the design was entirely his own." Reinhardt leaned forward. "May I see them?" Marie hesitated, then handed the drawings to Fournier. The inspector scanned them briefly. Dated and initialed by Duval himself. This could invalidate any claim of prior invention. Morel, who had been brought back upstairs at the commotion, gave a bitter laugh. "Convenient timing, madam. Your brother conveniently fears sabotage, conveniently writes to you, and conveniently you arrive through the snow the morning after his death." Marie's eyes flashed. "I drove from Lausanne before the worst of the storm hit. I have witnesses at the border post." Fournier nodded. "We will verify." Poirot had been silent, watching the interplay. Now he spoke. Interesting. A warning arrives posthumously. Drawings that secure the patent for the estate. And yet... He paused, eyes on the missing gear now lying on a side table. Someone still felt it necessary to plant this small piece of evidence against Monsieur Morel. He turned to Jacques. You were in the atelier alone with the prototype. You have access to every tool in this building. You could have constructed the gas mechanism in secret. Jacques shook his head violently. I would never harm him. He was like a father to me. Yet fathers can disappoint, Poirot said softly, particularly when they withhold knowledge from their sons. Tension thickened the air. The clocks struck 7, their chimes overlapping in discord. At that moment, a low groan came from the private atelier. One of the policemen appeared in the doorway. Inspector, the power is flickering again, and there is a smell, acrid, like almonds. Poirot moved first. The others followed. In the atelier, the emergency lamps dimmed, then steadied. Near the workbench lay a small glass capsule, newly cracked, vapor curling upward. Poirot waved everyone back. Another device, he said. Smaller, intended perhaps for a second victim. He bent closer without touching. Triggered by movement near the bench, a warning or an attempt. Madame Vallière gasped. Someone is trying to kill again. Poirot straightened. Not necessarily to kill, he murmured. Perhaps only to frighten, to confuse, to make us look in the wrong direction. He looked around the circle of faces. But the little grey cells, he said, they are no longer confused. Outside, the snowplow's rumble grew nearer. Inside, the danger had grown closer. Chapter 6. The morning light, pale and watery, filtered through the tall windows of the Atelier Duval, turning the snow outside into a featureless white wall. Inside, the air had grown stale with coffee grounds, cigarette smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. Inspector Fournier had cordoned off the private atelier after the discovery of the second gas capsule. No one was permitted near the workbench. The company sat scattered about the exhibition hall, some on chairs dragged into uneven rows, others standing in tense clusters, while 2 additional policemen stood guard at the exits. Poirot had not spoken for nearly 20 minutes. He paced slowly along the line of display cases, hands clasped behind his back, head bent as though listening to the clocks rather than the people. Every so often he paused before one of the mechanisms, a verge watch here, a marine chronometer there, and studied its motion with the same intensity he now applied to the puzzle before him. At last, he stopped before the ebony clock. Its pendulum swung with hypnotic regularity, the mother-of-pearl constellations catching faint gleams of light. Poirot reached out a small, plump hand and touched the glass face gently, as though reassuring the mechanism that all would soon be put in order. Ah, he murmured, almost to himself. The little grey cells, they have been patient. Now they speak. He turned sharply on his heel. Mesdames et messieurs, he announced in a voice that carried easily over the ticking, I should like you all to gather here before this magnificent Breguet timepiece. We have reached the moment when certain matters must be clarified. The group moved reluctantly, forming a loose semicircle. Fournier stood at the back, arms folded, watching. Poirot began with Jacques Benoit. Young man, he said gently, you have been most unfortunate. Your ambition is great, your talent undeniable, yet you allowed yourself to be drawn into a web not entirely of your making. Last night, when Mademoiselle Laurent accused you of being alone with the prototype, you denied it too vehemently. A guilty man protests, an innocent man explains. You did neither properly. Jacques flushed. I told the truth. I only checked the oil. Precisely, Poirot said. You checked the oil on an instrument you were forbidden to touch. Why? Because you had already seen something troubling, a small adjustment that should not have been there, a tube, perhaps, a vial. Jacques looked down at his hands. Poirot continued. You said nothing because you feared being blamed, and because you feared something worse, that your master had been betrayed by someone he trusted completely. He turned next to Sophie Laurent. Mademoiselle, your devotion to Monsieur Duval was genuine, yet devotion can blind. You restored his pieces with exquisite care, and you learned his methods intimately. You knew the bluing solution he preferred, the exact shade of ink he used for notes. When I found the scrap of paper under your tray, midnight, the Ebony Clock, bring the drawings. The ink matched your own supplies, not Duval's. Sophie drew a sharp breath. That note was planted. Indeed, Poirot agreed. But by whom? Not by you, I think. You would not write in your own hand so carelessly. He moved to Philippe Garnier. Monsieur Garnier, your hunter watch is most eloquent. It chimes the quarters with perfect regularity. Yet last night, when Duval collapsed at 11:23, your watch chimed the half-hour 2 minutes early. I noticed it because the sound clashed with the atelier clocks. A small thing, but significant. Your watch had been advanced. Why? To give yourself an alibi for a moment when you were not where you claimed to be? Garnier's ruddy face paled. I wound it incorrectly. A mistake. Perhaps, Poirot said. Or perhaps you needed to be seen elsewhere at a precise time. He faced Dr. Reinhardt. Herr Doctor, your company has coveted Duval's innovations for years. You spoke of licensing, of adaptation. Yet when the drawings were produced this morning, you leaned forward with unusual eagerness, not the eagerness of a businessman securing a deal, but of one verifying authenticity. You had seen those drawings before, not copies, the originals. Reinhardt's genial mask slipped. That is preposterous. Is it? You offered increased security. Duval refused, yet someone gained access to his safe. Someone who knew the combination, someone who had been in the atelier many times. Poirot turned at last to Madame Vallière and Lucien Morel, who stood side by side, though not willingly. Madame, he said softly, your left hand. You keep it hidden, always in the folds of your skirt, or behind your back. Not from nervousness, from shame. There is a small scar on the inside of your wrist, a burn, perhaps from acid. Hydrocyanic acid leaves such marks on those who handle it carelessly. You wore gloves during the demonstration, but one glove was pricked, by accident no doubt, when you adjusted the mechanism earlier in the evening. Claire Vallière stared at him. You cannot prove— I do not need to prove it yet, Poirot said. But consider this. The gas capsule found this morning was smaller, cruder, a warning device, not a lethal one. Someone wished to frighten us, to make us suspect a second murderer, or to make us believe the first was still active. Yet the first device was perfect, elegant, precise, hidden in the very mechanism Duval prized most. Only someone who understood his work intimately could have built it. He looked at Morel. And you, monsieur, the gear found under your floorboard, a clumsy plant, too obvious. Someone wished to divert suspicion from themselves by implicating you, the obvious rival, the man with the old grudge. Yet the gear was not from the prototype, it was from one of your own repeating watches on display here. I examined them last night. One balance cock is missing its endstone screw, a tiny brass gear that matches exactly. You did not notice because you have not touched your own collection since arriving. Morel's mouth opened, then closed. Poirot raised his voice slightly. The murderer is clever. He or she constructed a mechanism of exquisite cruelty, a gas release triggered not by time, but by the very act of winding the prototype. Duval would demonstrate his triumph. In doing so, he would die by his own hand, poetic, final. He paused. But there was one mistake, a psychological mistake. The murderer assumed Duval would bend close and inhale deeply when he noticed the sluggish balance. Yet Duval spoke first. Strange, the balance is sluggish. He drew only a small breath. Enough to kill, yes, but not instantly. He had time to stagger, to fall, to give us the exact moment of death. And in that moment he looked not at the prototype, but at one face in particular. Poirot stepped forward. He looked at you, Madame Vallières, and in his final glance there was not fear. There was sorrow. The sorrow of a man who realizes he has been betrayed by the person he loved most, like a daughter. Claire Vallières gave a small, choked sound. Her left hand emerged from the folds of her skirt. On the inside of her wrist, faint but unmistakable, was a thin, pink scar. Poirot's voice softened. You did not wish to kill him, madam. You wished only to delay the patent, to force a partnership, perhaps with Reinhardt's company, perhaps with Morel. You believed you could control the atelier after his death, but the gas was too swift. And now you have placed a second device to make it appear the work of another, to buy time. Silence fell, broken only by the steady beat of the ebony clock. Claire looked up, eyes bright with tears. I never meant for him to die, she whispered. I only wanted time. Poirot inclined his head. Time, he said gently, is the one thing we cannot rewind. He turned to Fournier. Inspector, the arrest, I think, may now be made. Fournier stepped forward. Outside, the snowplow's blades scraped the final meters of the Quai des Bergues. The city was reopening. Inside, one mechanism had stopped forever. Chapter 7. The snow had ceased at last. Through the tall windows of the Atelier Duval, pale sunlight reflected off the fresh drifts, casting a cold, crystalline light across the exhibition hall. The clocks struck noon in their staggered, harmonious discord, one by one, then together, as though marking the end of an era. Inspector Fournier had returned from a brief conference downstairs. The roads were passable, the forensic team en route, but he had agreed to Poirot's request. One final gathering before any formal arrest was made. The company assembled once more before the ebony clock. No one sat. They stood in a loose circle, faces pale with fatigue and apprehension. Jacques Benoit leaned against a display case for support. Sophie Laurent kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Philippe Garnier clutched his hunter watch as though it were a talisman. Dr. Reinhardt maintained an expression of detached curiosity. Lucien Morel stood rigid, arms folded tightly. Marie Duval, still clutching her brother's portfolio, watched her sister-in-law with quiet horror. Claire Vallières remained apart, near the door to the private atelier, her left hand no longer hidden. Poirot positioned himself beside the Breguet masterpiece, small and neat against its imposing blackness. He cleared his throat once, a small sound that somehow commanded the room. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, voice calm and precise, we have reached the dénouement. The mechanism has run its course. It is time to stop the hands and examine the works. He turned first to Claire Vallières. Madame, you loved Etienne Duval, not as a husband perhaps, but as the center of your world. The atelier was your life as much as his. When he announced the constant force escapement as his alone, you saw the future slipping away. You had managed the commercial side for years. You had negotiated with Reinhardt's company in secret. You believed a partnership would secure both your positions. But Etienne intended to keep control absolute. You decided to delay the patent long enough for negotiations to conclude in your favor. Claire's lips trembled, but she did not speak. You constructed the device with care, Poirot continued. A vial of hydrocyanic acid, obtained perhaps from the bluing solutions you yourself used, hidden beneath the base plate of the prototype. A tiny bellows triggered by the heat of a hand or the pressure of the winding key. Duval would demonstrate his masterpiece. In doing so, he would release his own death. Elegant, impersonal, the perfect crime for one who works with mechanisms rather than men. He paused. But there was hesitation. You wore gloves during the final assembly, yet one glove was pricked when you tested the mechanism earlier in the evening. A drop of acid touched your skin, hence the scar on your wrist. You did not intend immediate death. You hoped only to incapacitate him long enough to remove the prototype, to claim it had been stolen or damaged. But the gas was swifter than you anticipated. He collapsed before your eyes. Claire whispered, "I never wanted him dead." "Yet dead he is," Poirot said gently. And in his final moment, he looked at you. Not with accusation, but with sorrow. That look told me everything. The murderer was not driven by hatred, but by love turned possessive. He turned to the others. "To conceal the truth, madame, you planted small red herrings, the note in bluing ink beneath Mademoiselle Laurent's tray, written in your own hand, but placed where it would be found. You advanced Monsieur Garnier's watch by 2 minutes during the confusion after the body fell, knowing the chime would clash and draw attention. You took a gear from one of Monsieur Morel's repeating watches and hid it under his floorboard, knowing he was the obvious suspect, the man with the oldest grudge. You even placed the second smaller capsule this morning, hoping to suggest a second killer still at large." Morel's face darkened. "You used me." "I used everyone," Claire said quietly. "I was desperate." Poirot raised a hand. "But there was one clue you could not foresee." "The ebony clock itself." He gestured to the Breguet timepiece. "Last night, when Duval collapsed, I noticed something curious. The pendulum continued its swing without interruption. Yet the clock showed 11:25 when the police arrived at 11:23. 2 minutes fast. Why? Because someone had advanced it deliberately to align with Garnier's watch and create confusion about the exact time of death. But only one person had opportunity to touch the ebony clock unnoticed, the woman who had helped polish its case yesterday afternoon. You, madam." Claire closed her eyes. "Moreover," Poirot continued, "the second gas capsule was not meant to kill. It was a bluff, a device triggered by movement near the bench. You hoped we would believe a second attempt had been made, perhaps by Jacques or Sophie, to divert suspicion. But the capsule was clumsier than the first, less precise, the work of someone in haste, someone who no longer had access to the full resources of the atelier." He stepped closer to her. "You are not a monster, madame. You are a woman who believed she could control time itself, control the future of the atelier, of her own life. But time cannot be controlled. It runs on, indifferent to our schemes." Silence fell, broken only by the steady beat of the ebony clock. Claire Valliere looked up at last. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. "I loved him," she said. "I only wanted us to share what he built. I thought, if he were ill for a few days, the patent could wait. The partnership could be arranged." Poirot inclined his head. "Yet death does not wait, madame, and neither does justice." He turned to Fournier. "Inspector, the arrest may proceed." Fournier stepped forward, motioning to his men. Claire did not resist, as handcuffs were placed on her wrists. She looked once at the covered spot where her uncle-in-law had fallen, then away. As she was led toward the stairs, she paused. "Tell them," she said softly to Poirot, "that the drawings are genuine. The escapement was his alone. Let the atelier live on." Poirot nodded. It shall be done." The door closed behind her. The company remained in stunned silence. Poirot smoothed his moustaches with a small, precise gesture. "Order and method," he murmured. "They have prevailed." He looked around the circle of faces, shock, relief, lingering disbelief. "To the rest of you," he said gently, "there is no shame in having been deceived. The human heart is the most intricate mechanism of all. It can hide its workings even from those who know it best." He turned to the ebony clock and adjusted its hands forward by 2 minutes, bringing it into perfect alignment with the other timepieces in the room. The pendulum swung on, the case was closed. Chapter 8. The afternoon sun, low and pale over Geneva, slanted through the tall windows of the Atelier Duval, gilding the display cases and turning the brass mechanisms to warm gold. The snow outside had begun to melt in earnest. Rivulets ran down the panes, blurring the view of the Quai des Bergues. Inside, the clocks continued their quiet, inexorable march, each tick a small affirmation that time, at least, remained orderly. Claire Vallières had been taken away shortly after 1 o'clock. She had gone without protest, head high, though her hands trembled as the police car pulled away through the slush. Inspector Fournier had remained behind to oversee the final formalities: the removal of the second gas capsule, the sealing of the private atelier, the careful cataloguing of every tool and drawing. The forensic team had confirmed Poirot's deductions. The hydrocyanic acid residue matched traces found on a discarded glove in Claire's room, and the scar on her wrist bore the characteristic faint pitting of acid burn. The remaining company gathered once more in the exhibition hall, though the circle was smaller now, the air lighter, despite the lingering weight of tragedy. Jacques Benoit sat on a stool near his workbench, head in his hands. Sophie Laurent stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, in silent comfort. Philippe Garnier had wound his hunter watch back to the correct time, and now consulted it with something like relief. Dr. Reinhardt paced slowly before the ebony clock, hands clasped behind his back. Marie Duval, still clutching her brother's portfolio, had taken a chair near the window and watched the street below with quiet composure. Poirot stood apart near the centre of the room, surveying the scene with the satisfaction of a man who has restored a disordered mechanism to its proper rhythm. Fournier approached him, lowering his voice. "The magistrate has been informed. Madame Vallières will face charges of premeditated murder, though her counsel will no doubt argue diminished responsibility, perhaps even a crime passionnel. The drawings she mentioned have been secured. They are genuine, dated in Duval's hand. The patent will proceed in the name of his estate. The atelier will survive." Poirot inclined his head. "That is as it should be. Etienne Duval's work was greater than the frailties of those who surrounded him." Fournier hesitated. "You allowed her to speak? To explain? You might have let the arrest proceed in silence." "Silence," Poirot replied gently, "is sometimes crueler than confession. She needed to say the words aloud, to acknowledge what she had done. Only then could the mechanism stop spinning in chaos." Fournier nodded slowly. "You have a peculiar mercy, Monsieur Poirot." "Not mercy," Poirot corrected. "Order. When the truth is spoken, order returns, even to the human heart." The inspector glanced around the room. "And the others? They will carry scars from this night?" "Scars heal," Poirot said. "Lies fester. They have been spared that poison." He moved toward the group. Jacques looked up as Poirot approached. The young apprentice's eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "Monsieur Poirot, I feared I might have been blamed. I was foolish. I should have spoken sooner about what I saw." "You were loyal," Poirot said. Loyalty is not foolishness. It is only dangerous when it blinds us. You will continue here, I think? Jacques nodded. Madame Marie has asked me to stay. To help preserve his designs, I owe him that. Sophie Laurent stepped forward. And I will assist. The restorations, the polishing, the small miracles he taught us. They must not be lost. Poirot smiled faintly. Then the atelier lives. That is the best monument. Philippe Garnier cleared his throat. I shall not press my claim on the Ebony Clock. Not now. It belongs here. A wise decision, monsieur, Poirot murmured. Some treasures are not meant to be owned, only guarded. Dr. Reinhardt stopped pacing. My company will honor the patent when it is granted. We wanted partnership, not theft. Duval's name will remain on the mechanism. That much I can promise. Marie Duval rose from her chair. She carried the portfolio to Poirot and placed it in his hands. These are the originals, she said quietly. Etienne trusted you once, long ago with another matter. I trust you now to see they reach the patent office unmolested. Poirot accepted the portfolio with a small bow. It shall be done, madame. She looked at him for a long moment. He spoke of you often. The little Belgian with the magnificent moustaches, he called you. Said your mind was sharper than any escapement he ever built. Poirot permitted himself a modest smile. He was kind, but the mind is only a tool. The heart supplies the motive power. Marie's eyes filled, but she did not weep. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for bringing order back to his house. She turned away toward the window and the slowly melting city beyond. The others drifted toward the doors. Jacques and Sophie began quietly to tidy the benches. Garnier wound his watch one final time. Reinhardt paused before the ebony clock, studying its pendulum with new respect. Poirot remained where he was, hands clasped behind his back, watching them all. After a time, he spoke, softly, almost to himself. Human nature, he murmured, is a curious thing, so full of contradictions. Love and greed, loyalty and betrayal, all wound together like the mainspring of a watch. One small flaw, a moment of possessiveness, a desire to control the future, and the entire mechanism flies apart. Yet even then something endures, a design, a name, a few hands willing to carry on the work. He smoothed his moustaches with a precise gesture. Order and method, he said. They are not perfect, but they are enough. The clocks struck 3 in their gentle, overlapping chorus. Poirot turned toward the door. Outside, the streets of Geneva were beginning to stir again, cars moving cautiously through the slush, pedestrians emerging from doorways, life resuming its measured pace. He descended the stairs slowly, portfolio under his arm, overcoat buttoned against the lingering chill. At the curb, the same black Citroën waited. The driver opened the door without a word. Poirot paused on the step, looked back once at the tall windows of the atelier. Through the glass he could see the faint gleam of the ebony clock, its pendulum swinging steadily on. He nodded to it, a small private salute. Then he stepped into the car, the door closed softly. The Citroën pulled away, tires crunching over melting snow. Inside the vehicle, Poirot settled back against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. Bon, he murmured. A small smile touched his lips. The case was finished. The little grey cells could rest until the next disorderly human heart required their attention.